The morning mist clung to the grounds of Kensington Palace like a shroud, mirroring the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the royal household in recent weeks. Prince William stood at the tall windows of his private study, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the gardens where his mother once walked with him and Harry during their childhood visits. The weight of the decision he had made pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible crown, heavier than any burden he had carried as heir to the throne. It had been 3 months since the palace had quietly announced that the annual Diana Memorial Awards would undergo significant changes. What the public did not know was the personal battle that had raged behind closed doors, a battle that had ultimately led William to take a stand that would reshape his relationship with his stepmother forever. Catherine entered the study quietly, carrying a tea tray with the careful grace that had become second nature after years of royal protocol. She set it down on the mahogany desk and studied her husband's profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the distant look in his eyes that had become all too familiar lately. "You haven't slept again," she observed gently, pouring the Earl Grey tea into delicate china cups that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. The steam rose between them like unspoken words. William turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "How can I sleep knowing what's at stake?" he asked, accepting the cup she offered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her. I remember the promises I made." The her needed no clarification. Diana's presence had always lingered in the spaces between their conversations, but never more so than now. Catherine had learned to navigate these moments with the patience of someone who understood that loving William meant loving the memory of the woman who had shaped him in ways that went beyond mere genetics. "Tell me about the meeting with Charles again," Catherine requested, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. She had heard the story twice before, but she knew William needed to process it, to find clarity in the retelling. William's expression darkened as he recalled the conversation that had taken place in his father's private office at Clarence House just a week prior. The king had been reviewing documents when William arrived, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that reminded William uncomfortably of his grandfather Philip. "Father was diplomatic, as always," William began, his voice carrying a hint of bitter irony. He explained Camilla's desire to be more involved in the charitable works associated with Diana's legacy. He spoke of unity, of moving forward, of the importance of presenting a cohesive royal family to the public. Catherine watched as William's free hand unconsciously formed a fist. She had seen this reaction before, this physical manifestation of the internal struggle between duty and emotion that defines so much of royal life. But it was the way he said it, William continued, setting down his cup with more force than necessary. "As if my mother's memory was just another asset to be managed, another piece of the royal brand to be optimized for maximum public benefit." The conversation had escalated from there, with years of carefully suppressed resentment finally finding voice. William had reminded his father of Diana's own words about her charitable work, how she had specifically requested that her sons continue her legacy of compassion and genuine connection with those society often overlooked. "You weren't there when she planned those hospital visits," William had told Charles, his voice rising despite his efforts to maintain royal composure. "You weren't there when she explained to Harry and me why it mattered that we understand poverty, that we see beyond the palace walls. That wasn't protocol for her, it was personal." Charles had tried to redirect the conversation toward practical matters, explaining the complex web of royal patronages and the need to distribute responsibilities among senior working royals. But William had seen through the diplomatic language to the truth beneath. Camilla wanted to be associated with Diana's charitable legacy, and Charles was willing to facilitate that desire. "She has her own causes," William had argued. "Important ones. Why must she have access to the honors and recognitions that were created specifically to commemorate my mother's unique approach to charity?" The question had hung in the air between father and son like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Charles had removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture William recognized as his father's way of buying time to craft a careful response. "Because, William, she is now part of this family," Charles had finally said. "And families must move forward together, not remain forever anchored to the past." That word, past, had cut through William like a blade. His mother was not the past to him, she was the foundation upon which he built every decision, every public appearance, every moment of service to the crown. Diana was not history to be filed away, she was a living presence that informed his understanding of what royal duty could and should mean. Now, sitting in his study with Catherine, William felt the full weight of the choice he had made in response to his father's request. He had used his authority as Diana's eldest son and future king to formally object to Camilla's inclusion in any ceremony, award, or honor specifically created to commemorate his mother's charitable work. The staff at the Diana Memorial Foundation were surprised, Catherine said carefully, referring to the meetings that had taken place in the days following William's conversation with Charles.
But they understood your reasoning. William nodded grimly.
The foundation's board had been placed in an impossible position, caught between the current king's wishes and the explicit objections of the heir to the throne. In the end, they had sided with William, but not without significant behind-the-scenes negotiations and carefully worded statements that attempted to soften the blow to royal unity. "Harry called yesterday," William mentioned, his voice softening slightly at the mention of his brother. Despite the distance that had grown between them in recent years, some bonds remained unbreakable. "He supports the decision, even if he can't say so publicly."
Catherine smiled slightly, remembering her brother-in-law's tendency toward protective fierceness when it came to their mother's memory. "And the children? Have you thought about how to explain this to them when they're older?"
This question struck at the heart of William's deepest fears. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up in a world where their grandmother existed only in photographs and stories. How would he explain to them that there had been a time when he felt compelled to protect her legacy from those who would reshape it for their own purposes? "I want them to know that some things are worth fighting for," William said after a long pause. "That respect isn't just something you give because protocol demands it, it's something you earn through consistency and genuine care." The implications of William's decision extended far beyond the immediate family dynamics. Royal watchers and constitutional experts were already speculating about the long-term effects of such a public disagreement between the king and his heir. Some saw it as a dangerous precedent that could undermine royal authority, others viewed it as a necessary assertion of independence that proved the younger generation would not simply rubber-stamp decisions from above. For William, however, the constitutional implications mattered less than the personal ones. He had spent his entire adult life learning to balance his role as dutiful son with his responsibilities as Diana's living legacy. This decision represented a line in the sand, a declaration that some aspects of his mother's memory would remain inviolate, regardless of family pressure or public expectation.
"Do you think she would have approved?" Catherine asked, referring to Diana.
It was a question that haunted many of their private conversations, this constant wondering about how the people's princess would have navigated the modern challenges facing the royal family.
William considered the question seriously, as he always did when Diana's hypothetical opinion was sought.
"She would have understood," he said finally.
"Mother always said that authenticity was more important than appearances."
"She would have appreciated the honesty, even if she might have wished for a quieter resolution." The afternoon sun had begun to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the study floor. In a few hours, William would need to prepare for a public engagement, a visit to a homeless shelter that Diana had supported during her lifetime. The irony was not lost on him that he would be continuing her work even as he fought to protect it from being diluted by others' involvement. As Catherine gathered the tea things and prepared to leave him to his paperwork, she paused at the door. "You know this won't end here," she said gently. "Camilla won't simply accept this decision quietly, and neither will your father." William nodded, fully aware that his ban on Camilla's involvement in Diana-related honors was likely just the opening move in a longer, more complex battle for control over his mother's legacy. But he also knew that backing down now would set a precedent that could eventually erode everything Diana had worked to build. "I know," he replied, turning back to the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. "But some battles choose you, Catherine. This is one of them." As evening approached and the palace settled into its nightly routine, William remained at his post by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the gardens. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures to compromise or reconsider his position. But tonight, in the quiet of his study surrounded by photos of his mother and children, he felt the peace that comes with knowing he had honored a promise that transcended protocol and politics. The decision to ban Camilla from receiving his mother's honors was not just about protecting Diana's memory, it was about defining what kind of king he would become, what values he would prioritize, and what legacy he would leave for his own children. In taking this stand, William had chosen authenticity over convenience, principle over politics, and love over expedience. The weight of that choice would stay with him through the trials ahead, but so would the certainty that he had acted in accordance with the deeper truths his mother had taught him about service, sacrifice, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. The news broke on a grey Tuesday morning in October, when the royal correspondents gathered for what they assumed would be a routine briefing about upcoming engagements. Instead, they found themselves witnessing the most significant rift in the royal family since the abdication crisis nearly a century before. The headline that dominated every newspaper by evening was stark and uncompromising: Prince William blocks Queen Camilla from Diana honors. Camilla learned of the media coverage while having breakfast in the morning room at Clarence House. Her private secretary, Samantha Cohen, approached with visible reluctance, carrying the day's press summary that would normally contain routine coverage of royal activities. Instead, every major publication led with variations of the same story, each one more sensationalized than the last. "Your Majesty," Samantha began carefully, using the formal address that still felt new after the coronation, "there's been significant press coverage of yesterday's announcement regarding the Diana Memorial Foundation." Camilla looked up from her correspondence, noting the unusual tension in her secretary's voice. In the years since marrying Charles, she had developed an acute sensitivity to the subtle changes in staff behavior that often preceded difficult news. The palace was a place where information traveled through whispers and sideways glances long before it reached official channels. As she read through the headlines, Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, though those who knew her well would have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. The Daily Mail's coverage was particularly harsh, describing the situation as a son's fury and speculating about deep-seated resentment that had finally erupted into public view. "Has His Majesty seen these?" Camilla asked, gesturing toward the newspapers spread across her breakfast table like accusations. "He's in meetings with the private secretary this morning," Samantha replied diplomatically. "I believe they're discussing the appropriate response." What Samantha didn't mention was that Charles had been up since 5 o'clock, pacing in his study and making increasingly frustrated phone calls to various palace officials. The king was facing a crisis that struck at the very heart of his reign: a public rejection of his wife by his own heir, played out in newspapers across the Commonwealth. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, William was experiencing his own media storm. His private secretary had fielded 17 interview requests before 10 o'clock, each one seeking to understand the motivations behind what commentators were calling either a principled stand for his mother's memory or a calculated insult to the Queen. The phone call came at 11:15. William saw Clarence House on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. He had been expecting this conversation since the story broke, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. "William." His father's voice was clipped, formal, carrying the weight of both paternal disappointment and royal displeasure. "Father," William replied, settling back in his chair and preparing for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. "I assume you've seen the morning papers," Charles continued without preamble. "I assume you understand the position you've placed us all in." William had indeed seen the papers, but he had also seen something else: the flood of supportive messages that had begun arriving from Diana's former charities, from people whose lives she had touched, from those who understood that his decision wasn't about rejecting Camilla personally but about preserving something precious and irreplaceable. "I understand that you're upset," William said carefully. "But I also understand that some decisions transcend family politics." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Charles was sitting in the same office where he had tried to convince William to reconsider his position just weeks before. Now, with the media attention making private negotiation impossible, the stakes had risen exponentially. "This isn't just about family politics, as you put it," Charles said finally. "This is about the stability of the monarchy itself. When the heir to the throne publicly contradicts the king's wishes, it creates constitutional questions that go far beyond personal feelings." William understood the constitutional implications better than most. He had spent years studying the delicate balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary democracy, between personal conviction and institutional responsibility. But he had also learned from his mother that sometimes institutions needed to be challenged in order to remain relevant and meaningful. And
What about the constitutional implications of dishonoring my mother's memory? William asked, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. What message does that send about royal values and commitments?
The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with both men carefully avoiding the more personal elements of their disagreement while dancing around constitutional precedents and public relations concerns. Neither mentioned Diana by name again, though her presence hovered over every exchange like a third participant in the call. When William finally hung up, he felt the familiar weight of isolation that came with difficult decisions. Being heir to the throne meant that every choice carried consequences far beyond personal preference, but it also meant that sometimes he had to stand alone against pressure from every direction. At Clarence's house, Charles was having his own moment of reflection. After ending the call with William, he sat quietly in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his new reign, official photographs, state papers, the red dispatch boxes that followed him everywhere. But his thoughts were drawn to an older photograph on his desk, one taken during the early days of his relationship with Camilla, when they both believed that time and patience would eventually heal all wounds. The irony was not lost on him that his efforts to integrate Camilla more fully into royal life had instead highlighted the divisions that still existed within his own family. He had hoped that associating her with Diana's charitable legacy would demonstrate continuity and healing, but William's response had made clear that some wounds were too deep for such simple solutions. Camilla, meanwhile, was dealing with her own complex emotions. She had never sought to replace Diana in any meaningful sense, understanding from the beginning that such a goal would be both impossible and inappropriate. What she had wanted was recognition for her own contributions to royal life, acknowledgement that her decades of service had earned her a place in the family's charitable endeavors. The rejection stung not just because it was public, but because it felt personal in a way that cut through years of careful protocol and diplomatic relations. Despite all the progress she thought had been made, William's decision suggested that she remained an outsider in fundamental ways, tolerated but never truly accepted as family. The public reaction was swift and divided. Diana's former charities issued statements supporting William's position, with several high-profile figures from her charitable network making it clear that they viewed his decision as protecting something sacred. The CEO of Centrepoint, the homeless charity that Diana had championed, released a statement saying that the princess's approach to charitable work was unique and personal, and those qualities should be preserved in how her legacy is honored. But others saw William's actions as unnecessarily divisive. Several constitutional experts appeared on television to discuss the precedent being set and the potential implications for future royal decision-making. Professor Sarah Bradford, a royal biographer, suggested on BBC News that this very public disagreement raises serious questions about the coordination and unity that the monarchy needs to function effectively. The divide in public opinion reflected deeper questions about the role of the monarchy in modern Britain. For some, William's stand represented exactly the kind of principled leadership they wanted to see from the future king, someone willing to prioritize values over convenience. For others, it suggested a dangerous willingness to prioritize personal grievances over institutional stability. Within the royal household, staff members found themselves navigating an increasingly complex situation. Private secretaries who normally coordinated seamlessly between different royal offices now had to manage conflicting priorities and incompatible positions. The usual protocols for managing family disagreements had proved inadequate for such a public and fundamental dispute. Catherine found herself in a particularly delicate position. As William's wife, she supported his decision completely, understanding the emotional and principled reasons behind it. But, as a member of the royal family, she also understood the importance of presenting a united front to the public. Her own relationship with Camilla had always been cordial but somewhat distant, built on mutual respect rather than genuine warmth. At a private lunch with several close friends from her pre-royal days, Catherine spoke honestly about the strain the situation was placing on everyone involved. "It's not about choosing sides," she explained to Emma Sale, one of her oldest friends. "It's about understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting difficult consequences." Her friends, who had watched Catherine navigate royal life with grace and intelligence for over a decade, recognized the careful way she was balancing her roles as wife, future queen, and family mediator. They could see the toll that the public scrutiny was taking, but they could also see her unwavering support for her husband's decision.
The situation became even more complex when Harry's representatives issued a carefully worded statement from California. Without explicitly taking sides, the statement expressed Harry's deep respect for his mother's legacy and his support for decisions made in her honor. The diplomatic language couldn't hide the fact that Harry, despite his complicated relationship with William, was backing his brother's position. This development added another layer of pressure on Charles and Camilla, making clear that the disagreement wasn't limited to William's personal feelings but reflected a broader family consensus about Diana's memory and legacy. The statement from Harry also ensured that the story would continue to dominate headlines, as commentators analyzed every word for hidden meanings and future implications. Behind the scenes, palace officials were working frantically to contain the damage and find some path toward resolution. The Queen's former private secretary, Sir Edward Young, was brought in as an unofficial mediator, his decades of experience managing royal crises making him uniquely qualified to navigate such sensitive territory. His initial assessment was sobering. This wasn't a disagreement that could be resolved through traditional diplomatic means or quiet compromise. The positions had become too public, the principles too clearly stated, for either side to back down without significant loss of face and credibility. As the days passed and the media coverage intensified, it became clear that William's decision to ban Camilla from Diana-related honors had unleashed forces that none of them had fully anticipated. What had begun as a family disagreement about charitable patronages had evolved into a constitutional crisis that would test the very foundations of the modern monarchy. The storm was far from over, and everyone involved began to understand that the resolution would require more than just family reconciliation. It would demand a fundamental renegotiation of relationships, expectations, and the very meaning of royal service in the 21st century. 3 weeks after the initial media explosion, the true cost of William's decision was becoming painfully clear to everyone within the royal household. The carefully orchestrated machinery of the monarchy, built on centuries of protocol and mutual cooperation, had ground to an uncomfortable halt as family members struggled to navigate public appearances and official duties while maintaining their increasingly incompatible positions. The first major test came during the annual Remembrance Day ceremonies at the cenotaph. For the royal family, this solemn occasion had always represented their unity in honoring those who had served and sacrificed for the nation. But, as the family gathered on the balcony overlooking Whitehall, the physical positioning that royal protocol demanded suddenly became loaded with political meaning. Camilla stood in her designated position as queen, but the careful distance William maintained between himself and his stepmother was noted by every photographer and royal correspondent present. Body language experts would later analyze frame-by-frame footage of the ceremony, pointing out the subtle ways that family tension manifested in formal public settings. Catherine, standing beside William in a black coat that echoed Diana's style from similar ceremonies decades before, found herself serving as an unintentional buffer between the warring factions of her husband's family. Her training in royal protocol had prepared her for many challenges, but navigating a public family feud while maintaining the dignity required of such occasions pushed her diplomatic skills to their limits. The ceremony proceeded without obvious incident, but those close to the family could see the strain. Charles's jaw was set throughout the 2-minute silence, his usual composed demeanor cracked just enough to reveal the pressure he was under. When he laid his wreath at the memorial, his movements carried a weight that went beyond the solemnity of the occasion. After the public ceremony, the traditional private reception at Buckingham Palace became an exercise in careful choreography. Palace staff had spent days planning seating arrangements and conversation groupings that would minimize awkward encounters while maintaining the appearance of family unity. But even the most skilled royal handlers couldn't completely eliminate the tension that permeated every interaction. William arrived at the reception with Catherine and their children, the young princes and princess, serving as welcome distractions from the adult tensions swirling around them. George, Charlotte, and Louis were blissfully unaware of the complex family dynamics, greeting their grandfather and step-grandmother with the natural warmth of children who saw only beloved family members, not constitutional adversaries. Watching his grandchildren interact with Camilla, Charles felt a complicated mixture of emotions. The children represented the future of the monarchy he was working to preserve, but their father's actions threatened to create lasting divisions that could damage the institution for generations to come. How could he explain to George, the future king, that his father had publicly defied royal authority over matters of family honor? The conversation between Charles and
William. That day was brief and formal, observed by dozens of guests and staff members who were acutely aware of its significance. They discussed upcoming engagements and administrative matters with the careful politeness of diplomats managing a tense international relationship rather than the easy familiarity of father and son. The foundation boards are meeting next week, William mentioned, referring to the various organizations that managed Diana's charitable legacy. They'll need clarity about future patronage arrangements. Charles nodded stiffly. I'm sure they'll manage their responsibilities appropriately, he replied, the words carrying layers of meaning that both men understood but couldn't address directly in such a public setting. Camilla, meanwhile, was experiencing her own form of isolation. Several of the guests who would normally seek her out for conversation seemed uncertain about how to approach her, unsure whether acknowledging the situation would be appropriate or whether ignoring it would be preferred. The result was a subtle but noticeable cooling in the usual social dynamics that surrounded royal events. Lady Susan Hussey, one of the late Queen's most trusted companions, found herself in a particularly difficult position. Having served the royal family for decades, she understood both the importance of institutional loyalty and the complex emotions surrounding Diana's memory. During a quiet moment in the reception, she approached Camilla with characteristic directness. This too shall pass, she said simply, her words carrying the weight of someone who had weathered many royal storms over the years. The family has survived worse divisions than this. Camilla smiled gratefully, recognizing the gesture of support even as she wondered whether Lady Susan was right. Some wounds, she was learning, cut too deep for time alone to heal completely. The ripple effects of the family rift extended far beyond formal occasions. Palace staff found themselves caught between competing loyalties and conflicting instructions. Private secretaries who had spent years coordinating seamlessly between different royal offices now struggled with basic scheduling questions when events involved both sides of the family divide. The situation became particularly complex for joint charitable endeavors that had been planned months in advance. The Prince's Trust, Charles's flagship charity, had scheduled several events that were meant to include both William and Camilla as participants. Now, those events required complete reorganization to avoid the appearance of either confrontation or forced reconciliation. One such event, a gala dinner for disadvantaged youth, became a symbol of the broader challenges facing royal coordination. Originally planned as a celebration of intergenerational royal commitment to youth development, the guest list and program had to be completely restructured when William's office made it clear that he would not attend any function where Camilla was being honored for charitable work. The reorganization wasn't just logistically complex, it was emotionally painful for everyone involved. The young people who were meant to benefit from the gala found themselves caught in an adult conflict that had nothing to do with their needs or aspirations. Several of them had specifically requested to meet both William and Camilla, having been inspired by different aspects of their charitable work. When news of the gala's restructuring leaked to the press, it provided fresh fuel for media commentary about the cost of royal family divisions. The Daily Express ran a particularly pointed editorial questioning whether personal grudges should interfere with charitable work that benefits society's most vulnerable members. The criticism stung because it touched on something that both William and Charles genuinely cared about, their responsibility to serve others through their royal roles. Neither man wanted their personal disagreement to harm the causes they supported, but neither was willing to compromise the principles that had led to their conflict. Behind the scenes, various family members and trusted advisors began attempting informal mediation efforts. The Princess Royal, known for her no-nonsense approach to family matters, arranged separate meetings with both William and Charles, hoping to find some middle ground that would allow for face-saving compromises on both sides. Anne's conversation with William took place at her home in Gloucestershire, away from the formal atmosphere of royal palaces that seemed to intensify every interaction. Over afternoon tea in her comfortable sitting room, she spoke with the directness that had always characterized their relationship. "Your mother wouldn't have wanted this level of public discord," Anne said, getting straight to the heart of the matter. She understood better than most how family divisions could damage the monarchy's credibility. William respected his aunt's perspective, knowing that Anne had been one of the few family members who had maintained a consistently supportive relationship with Diana throughout the difficult years of her marriage to Charles. If anyone could speak with authority about Diana's wishes, it was Anne. But she also wouldn't have wanted her legacy diluted or misrepresented, William replied.
Some principles are worth defending, regardless of the immediate costs.
Anne studied her nephew carefully, seeing both his father's stubbornness and his mother's passionate commitment to her beliefs. "The question," she said finally, "is whether you're defending your mother's legacy or your own pain about losing her." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive, cutting through the constitutional and charitable arguments to the emotional core of William's decision. But it also revealed something important about Anne's own understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about charitable patronages or family politics, but about unresolved grief and the complex process of honoring a parent's memory while building an independent adult life. Anne's meeting with Charles was equally direct but focused on different concerns. As someone who had devoted her entire adult life to royal service, she was particularly troubled by the institutional implications of the current crisis. The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to present continuity and stability, she reminded her brother. Public family disputes undermine that fundamental strength, regardless of who's right or wrong on the underlying issues. Charles appreciated Anne's institutional perspective, but he was also frustrated by what he saw as William's refusal to consider the broader implications of his actions. "I've spent my entire life preparing for this role," he told her.
"I understand the need for continuity and stability better than anyone.
But I also need to be able to make decisions about how royal responsibilities are distributed without having my authority publicly challenged by my own heir."
The constitutional dimension of their disagreement was indeed unprecedented in modern royal history.
While royal family members had certainly disagreed privately about various matters, the level of public knowledge about this particular dispute created new challenges for palace officials trying to maintain institutional credibility. Professor Vernon Bogdaner, one of Britain's leading constitutional experts, was invited to provide private guidance to senior palace officials about the historical precedents and potential implications of the situation. His assessment was sobering. While the monarchy had survived more serious constitutional crises, those had typically involved external political challenges rather than internal family divisions played out in public view. "The danger," he explained in a confidential briefing, "is that this creates a perception that royal authority is contingent and negotiable rather than established and reliable. If the heir can publicly reject the king's decisions on matters within royal prerogative, it raises questions about the consistency and predictability that constitutional monarchy requires." But Professor Bogdaner also acknowledged that William's position had constitutional merit. As someone with his own inherited responsibilities regarding his mother's legacy, he could argue that he was protecting established precedents rather than creating new ones. The complexity of the situation reflected broader tensions within the modern monarchy about individual agency versus institutional loyalty. As winter deepened and the initial media frenzy began to settle into longer-term analysis, it became clear that William's decision had created a new reality that would require fundamental adjustments from everyone involved. The easy assumption that family loyalty would always override personal conviction had been shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding of the competing principles that could drive royal decision-making. For William, the price of his principled stand was becoming clearer each day. Beyond the obvious strain on family relationships, he was discovering that every public appearance now carried additional scrutiny. Every charitable engagement was analyzed for its symbolic meaning regarding his relationship with his father and stepmother. But he was also discovering unexpected sources of support and validation. Letters continued to arrive from people whose lives had been touched by Diana's work, expressing gratitude for his decision to protect her memory. Several former palace staff members from Diana's era reached out privately to share their own memories and their appreciation for his stand. The principle had been established and defended, but the full cost of that defense was still being calculated by everyone whose lives had been changed by William's decision to ban Camilla from receiving his mother's honors. The turning point came 6 months later, in the most unexpected way possible. It was Charlotte, William's 8-year-old daughter, who inadvertently created the opening for reconciliation during a family Easter celebration at Windsor Castle. The little princess, with the innocent directness that only children possess, approached her grandfather during the traditional Easter egg hunt and asked a question that cut through months of adult complexity with startling clarity. "Grandpapa," Charlotte said, tugging on Charles's jacket while holding a chocolate egg decorated with spring flowers, "why doesn't Daddy smile when Grandmama Camilla is here anymore?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable. Charles knelt down to his granddaughter's level, looking into eyes that held Diana's distinctive blue but reflected Catherine's gentle wisdom. For the first time in months, he found himself considering the family crisis from a child's perspective, seeing it not as a constitutional challenge or a personal betrayal, but as a source of confusion and sadness for the innocent members of the family who had done nothing to deserve the tension that surrounded them. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things, Charles explained carefully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was suddenly seeing his situation with new clarity. But that doesn't mean we don't love each other. Charlotte considered this answer with the seriousness that marked all her interactions with family members. Mummy says that when people love each other, they find ways to fix disagreements, she said, unconsciously echoing one of Catherine's favorite principles about family relationships. That evening, after the public portions of the Easter celebration had concluded and most of the extended family had departed, Charles found himself alone in his private study at Windsor, contemplating his granddaughter's words. The official dispatch boxes sat unopened on his desk as he struggled with a realization that had been building for months but had finally crystallized in that moment with Charlotte. He had been so focused on the constitutional implications of William's decision, so concerned about royal authority and institutional precedent, that he had lost sight of the human relationships at the heart of the monarchy. Charlotte's question had reminded him that their disagreement wasn't just affecting William and Camilla, it was creating stress and confusion for everyone in their extended family, including children who deserved better from the adults who were meant to provide them with security and stability. The next morning brought an unexpected development. William received a phone call from his father, but instead of the formal, tension-filled conversations that had characterized their recent interactions, Charles spoke with a vulnerability that caught William completely off guard. "I've been thinking about what Charlotte said yesterday," Charles began, his voice carrying none of the official weight that had marked their recent communications. "She's right to be confused by our behavior. We've let our disagreement overshadow our responsibilities to the family, especially to the children." William, sitting in his study at Kensington Palace while Catherine handled the children's breakfast routine, felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the voice of the king defending institutional prerogatives, this was his father, expressing genuine concern about the family dynamics they had created. "I've been thinking about it too," William admitted. "George asked me last week why Easter dinner felt heavy this year. 8 years old, and he can already sense the tension we think we're hiding." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared since the crisis began. Instead of constitutional arguments and institutional concerns, they talked about memories, Charles sharing stories about William's childhood reactions to family stress, William describing his children's questions about family relationships that he struggled to answer honestly. "I never wanted to put you in a position where you felt you had to choose between family loyalty and honoring your mother," Charles said, the words carrying an acknowledgement that had been absent from all their previous discussions. "That was never my intention." William felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same complex mixture of love and frustration that had characterized his relationship with his father since childhood. "And I never wanted to publicly challenge your authority," he replied. "But I couldn't find any other way to protect something that felt essential to preserve." They talked for nearly an hour, working through layers of misunderstanding and unspoken assumptions that had complicated their disagreement from the beginning. Charles explained his perspective about family unity and the challenges of integrating Camilla into royal life after decades of public scrutiny. William shared his concerns about preserving the authentic spirit of his mother's charitable approach in an age of increasing royal commercialization. But the breakthrough came when Charles made a statement that acknowledged the legitimacy of William's position in a way he had been unable to do before. "Your mother's approach to charity was indeed unique," he said. "Perhaps I was wrong to think that uniqueness could be transferred or shared without being diminished." For William, hearing his father acknowledge Diana's special qualities without defensiveness or qualification felt like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. "I'm not trying to create a shrine," he said. "I just want to make sure that when people receive honors in her name, they understand what those honors represent." The conversation ended with an agreement to meet privately later that week, away from palace settings and media attention, to explore possible paths forward that could address both men's concerns. But, more importantly, it ended with a restoration of honest communication that had been absent from their relationship for months. Camilla's role in the eventual resolution proved to be more gracious and substantial than anyone had anticipated. When Charles shared the details of his conversation with William, her response revealed depths of understanding and emotional intelligence that even her critics had to acknowledge.
"Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "this was never really about me personally.
Perhaps it was about William needing to establish his own authority over aspects of his inheritance, and I simply became the focal point for that process." Her insight proved remarkably prescient. In the weeks that followed, as the family worked toward a resolution, it became clear that the crisis had been as much about generational transition and the establishment of boundaries as it had been about charitable patronages or Diana's memory. The solution they eventually developed was elegant in its simplicity and wisdom. Rather than continuing to fight over existing Diana-related honors, they created a new framework that recognized different types of charitable contribution. William would maintain exclusive authority over awards and recognitions that specifically honored Diana's personal approach to charity, her direct, emotional connection with vulnerable populations, and her ability to humanize complex social issues. But a separate category of recognitions was established for broader royal charitable work that honored the values Diana had championed without claiming to replicate her specific methods. This category would be open to all working royals, including Camilla, acknowledging their contributions to causes like domestic violence prevention, literacy promotion, and social inclusion that had been important to Diana but were not exclusively associated with her personal legacy.
The announcement of this new framework was carefully managed to emphasize family unity and shared commitment to charitable service.
The press statement, crafted after weeks of careful negotiation, described the changes as an evolution rather than a resolution of conflict, suggesting natural development rather than crisis management. But, for those within the royal family, the deeper significance was clear. William had succeeded in protecting what he saw as the essential core of his mother's legacy while allowing other family members to contribute meaningfully to the broader charitable mission she had inspired. Charles had maintained his authority as king while acknowledging his son's legitimate role in managing inherited responsibilities. Perhaps most importantly, Camilla had found a way to contribute to Diana-inspired charitable work without appearing to claim Diana's unique position or legacy. Her first project under the new framework was a domestic violence prevention initiative that honored Diana's groundbreaking work in that area while drawing on Camilla's own decades of experience and advocacy. The public response to the resolution was overwhelmingly positive, with commentators noting the maturity and wisdom displayed by all parties in finding a solution that honored competing interests without requiring anyone to abandon their principles.
Constitutional experts praised the precedent being set for managing family disagreements within institutional frameworks rather than through public conflict.
For Catherine, who had played a quiet but crucial mediating role throughout the crisis, the resolution represented validation of her belief that patient diplomacy and genuine listening could overcome even seemingly intractable family divisions. Her relationship with Camilla, which had been strained by the months of tension, gradually warmed as both women worked together on aspects of the new charitable framework.
The children, of course, noticed the change immediately.
George remarked to his mother that family dinners don't feel heavy anymore, while Charlotte told her grandfather that she was glad Daddy smiles again when Grandmama Camilla visits. For William, the resolution brought a complex mixture of satisfaction and reflection. He had achieved his primary goal of protecting his mother's legacy while learning important lessons about the costs and benefits of principled stands within family systems. The experience had tested his relationships with people he loved while ultimately strengthening his understanding of his own values and priorities. As the first anniversary of the crisis approached, William found himself back in his study at Kensington Palace, looking out at the same gardens where he had first wrestled with his decision to ban Camilla from Diana-related honors. But, now, instead of feeling the weight of isolated decision-making, he felt the comfort of having navigated a difficult challenge while maintaining both his principles and his family relationships. The resolution hadn't erased all tensions or solved all problems, but it had demonstrated that even the most fundamental disagreements could be addressed through honest communication, mutual respect, and creative problem-solving. Most importantly, it had shown that protecting Diana's memory didn't require rejecting Camilla's contributions, and honoring family unity didn't require abandoning individual principles. In the end, Charlotte's simple question about why her father no longer smiled had opened a path toward healing that months of formal negotiations had failed to achieve. Sometimes, the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources, and the strongest families are those that can learn from their youngest members while working through their most challenging conflicts. The story of William's ban on Camilla receiving Diana's honors became a testament to the possibility of principled compromise and the power of family love to overcome even the most serious disagreements. It proved that protecting one person's legacy doesn't require diminishing another's contributions, and that the strongest institutions are those that can evolve and adapt while maintaining their core values and commitments. As William prepared for his eventual reign, the experience had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, family dynamics, and the complex balancing act required of modern royalty. He had learned that sometimes standing alone for important principles is necessary, but he had also learned that the ultimate goal should always be finding ways to bring people together rather than keeping them apart. The resolution marked not just the end of a family crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter in royal relationships, one built on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and shared commitment to service that honored the past while embracing the future.